So what we're going to be going over today is how to create a semi-dynamic grading for these lots using a corridor and some pretty weird looking assemblies, but at the end of the day it gets the job done. But I set up the split view so that you can see on the right side once we actually get into the grading what it's going to look like from a 3D standpoint. So here's my profile that we're going to be using for the corridor. Pretty basic. And then here are my two assemblies. The top one, that's going to be the one that we're going to use for just a basic section. And then the bottom one is the one I'm going to use for grading the lots. And those green squares you saw were my boundaries of where I want my grading to happen. So they're about 30 feet wide by 70, pretty typical smaller lots here in San Antonio. So let's go ahead and, what I want to touch on this is, these are going to be C lots, which means they're going to grade to the back. What I've done with this one is once we're out of the parkway coming up at 2%, we're going to drop back and grade to the back at 5%. What I've done with this is I've just used a basic transition lane and I'm having it hold the offset but change the elevation. On this one, what I'm doing for the pad itself is I'm having it hold the elevation and hold the offset, so I get my 70-foot long graded pad. And this will just make it a little bit easier. I mean, if you wanted to, depending on what your grading is like, you could actually just change that to hold the offset and change the elevation if you had varying slopes across the pad. So let's go ahead and move over to the actual grading, where we're going to do the grading. And I do already have a corridor with the regions just to save time that you guys can take a look at here. And I'm going to turn actually I'm going to turn all of them on. Go ahead and do that. Now what we're going to have to do is refresh or rebuild the corridor so that our regions show up. And actually once I hit OK, you'll be able to see all of the surface and everything that it created. So you'll be able to see right off the bat, here's our surface, but you can see there's our high point for the right-of-way, and then grading back for the lots. And you can see it, I mean, right now everything's just following existing ground. So it's pretty easy from here. I mean, there's our surface. What we're gonna do is, since we went ahead and set up that lane transition, so here's our regular section, here's our pad, and the area we're going to be changing is right in here where it says to pad at the end. That's where we're going to be adding everything in, as far as the feature lines to make it somewhat dynamic. So there's our next section, next pad, so on and so forth. So now let's go ahead and create these feature lines. And I've already went ahead and added some surface labels just so that it'll make it a little bit faster. So we're going to add our first one here using the insert. That way it grabs the vertical And then we're just going to come across the pad. That way we're flat across the front of the pad. And make sure our grade is 0. And let's go ahead and do that for the next lot. Make sure our grade is 0. Do our next lot. Since I didn't have a point here, I'm just going to pull it off the surface, which is another thing you can do if you didn't want to go ahead and add these points in beforehand. And we'll do our last one. Pull it off of the surface. Come to the end, make sure our grade is 0. Okay. So you can see on the right side, I mean, not a whole lot has changed. Now what we're going to do is come into our areas and set our targets. So we're going to set that one that goes to pad. We're going to grab the first feature line. So now what this is going to do is it's going to make that basic lane transition 20 feet out, which is where my pad is going to start. It's going to make it flat across there. And that in turn, you'll see, once I do the rest of these, will make the grading of the pad itself flat across it as it slopes towards the back. So here I'm doing the third one. And let's do the last one. And once I go ahead and rebuild the corridor, you will see the surface contours change, and you'll see the right side change. There you go. So you can see, from this view, let me go ahead and rotate it a little bit. You can see we're flat across the front, and then our pads are flat across, sloping towards the back, just like we wanted. And so the reason we would want to do it this way is, in the event, as always, that somebody comes back with some kind of change, since it is a corridor and our lanes are transition, if we wanted to put a super elevation in or anything like that, we could, and still make it somewhat dynamic. We would just have to change these front feature lines to make sure that our pad graded correctly through the back. As you can see right here from the side, there we do have fall from front to back, even after the pads. And like I was saying earlier, I mean, we're flat here across the front. But if we wanted to add, let's say, a swale right here on the side, just to make sure that this bottom pad doesn't get water in it, I mean, you can just do a feature line, set it off of the surface like I'm doing here. It's falling back at 3%, like our assembly had it. I'm just going to do a grading object, offset it 1.5 feet, so I get a 6-inch drop. And then now I'm just going to add this feature line to my surface. And here you got it. Now we have a swale on the side of our pad. So again, if for some reason the grading was to change, like this one's at 3.8, next one's at 2 and some change. So if we wanted to drop this side to flatten these guys out for earthwork purposes, we could. And like I was saying, I mean, you could change the pad lane transition to where you can add a feature line at the back of the pad. That way you can control the grade across the pad by adding another target. Well, I hope you guys liked this video, and if you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to add them below. thank you for your time.